Hi, everybody, and welcome to our second season of the Voices Project. We're really excited that our topic for today is actually going to kick off on something which has been an extremely important discussion happening on various different multilateral bodies within this region, and that is, where does medical education and med tech technology all fit into this next chapter as this region now starts to move in its various different ways to finding solutions that are critical in managing health systems and diseases in themselves. I'm Rohit Sehgal. I'm the Chief Strategist at the Voices Project, a neutral, completely independent and non-profit platform. Our aim and objective is simply to produce deeper insights and knowledge on various public health issues that affect us in this region of Asia Pacific. What we try and do is try and root it in local circumstances, experiences, and of course, divergences. And if any one of our listeners remembered our first season, what we tried to really do was to peel that onion in a way of what are some of our key policy gaps facing particular circumstances. And we focused on things like cervical cancer. We focused on the need for behavioral change and segmentation, and some really great stuff. And I think moving into that same stream, this season is really trying to put together a regional understanding and framework for the role of tech in life sciences. How do we mobilize knowledge? How do we get experience from across a region to unify and strengthen research and discourse? And in doing so, let's try and understand, particularly here, the asymmetric distribution, the disparities within Asia Pacific. That really is important, that we can take learnings from one part into another. And let's try and create some consensus, because as we always say, it's about changing lives, but it's all about one step at a time. Right, so let's dive into this. I'm joined today by two very special people. In fact, probably my favorite people to be talking to today, and have been really waiting for this discussion. I have Dr. Karen Priyadarshini, the worldwide lead for Health and Life Sciences JPAC at Microsoft, and Dr. Hiran Sivaraj, the co-founder and CEO of OncoShot. And I'll give them a moment to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about what makes them tick. Karen, would you like to go first?
Yeah, Rohit, thank you so much. And hello, Dr. Hiran as well. Nice to be speaking with you both. I think what you mentioned as the goal of this particular discussion we're going to have is just the thing that I do. How do we work with clients in health and life sciences to be able to help them digitally transform? And as you know, we're almost post-COVID right now. This is the golden period where we did see a lot of acceleration of use of technology in filling up some of the gaps that we have in the entire care continuum. And that, I think, is a very exciting period. And I really look forward to sharing a bit more on how technology has enabled health and life sciences.
Thanks, Karen. Hiran, yourself?
Thanks for the opportunity to participate in this session, and it's a pleasure to be on the same podium as Karen as well. So just as a quick background, I used to be in the public sector as a practicing oncologist treating breast cancer patients. I still see some patients on a weekly basis. Survival for breast cancer has tremendously improved over the last decade, thankfully. However, much of my work today is centered around building ecosystems, where we are looking at how do we actually connect stakeholders such as hospitals, industry partners such as pharmaceuticals, biotech, and CROs, for the primary purpose of allowing information to flow, and from that flow of information to actually result in better outcomes for patients with better access to newer therapies for cancer. So today's session is really close to my heart. The work that we do today is across obviously developed countries such as in Singapore, but also countries where access to healthcare can be quite disparate, where we work in Australia as well as in India, for example, where patients still need access to better therapies, but the way we go about doing it can be quite different in those markets as well. And hopefully, we can share more as we move along.
Thanks so much. Right, so listeners, let's get into this, because I think we're going to learn a lot, and hopefully we begin to appreciate just exactly what it means to have technology and healthcare working hand in hand. So let me give an analogy, and an aviation analogy. If healthcare is the aircraft and technology is similar to a runway and the fly-by-wire system, many are saying that we're missing to calculate the length of the runway needed for critical healthcare solutions. And some might be thinking, are we risking overshooting the runway? Or are we flying blind in a somewhat post-pandemic chronic preventative care and treatment ecosystem? And so fundamentally, listeners, the question is, are we across health services, across the region, are patients and policymakers, data technology, how does it play a stronger role? And that often used word multilateral development solutions, right? How do we create sustainable and scalable solutions that can really get us to where we can have better understandings and better solution making? And I think this is where understanding where has the evolution of technology and the outcomes in critical development sector strategies, have they been really delivered? So let's get into this. Let me open this up to Hiren and to Kiran. It's going to be a slightly difficult question. The role of life sciences and pharma companies, as Hiren you just mentioned, and that intersecting with data and technology and various other mediums has been orbiting around disease prevention, things that matter extremely importantly to many folks here, the patient pathways, hospital deliveries, efficiencies, long-term care. But it's been said that there's still some slip between the cup and the lip. Has the pandemic somewhat created a more conducive synergy for technology and healthcare? Or is this situation that we see technology on one side, and then we see health domain experience on the other, the patient, the lives, the health service providers? Do we see them coexisting? Do we see them coming closer together? I thought that's a good place to maybe get some opinions out there for our listeners who might not be so deeply well-versed in this. Hiren, why don't we start with you? You've had some, I think, some pretty interesting experiences, I would say, in the last few years.
Thanks, Rohit. So that's a great question to think about. And the way I look at it is, if you look at across multiple industry sectors, and the adoption of technology as they've evolved, probably healthcare is one of the last few to fully adopt technology in the way that we've seen it being pervasive in other industries. There are a lot of fundamental reasons behind that. And that's because healthcare has intrinsically been a very complex multi-stakeholder ecosystem. The role of the care provider can be very different from the role of the payer or the insurer. And then you have, of course, the patient in the center of it all. And additional service, stakeholders such as industry, who typically used to be the hub of innovation, where the new therapies for care, for treatment were being developed. And that interplay was very, very complex. So naturally, the evolution of that evolve in a very siloed perspective where, typically those patients or the healthcare systems where they functioned in, they operated in a silo and everyone else was outside. You do your innovation in your own silo, and then you try to make things work between silos. Now that has resulted in a lot of legacy issues. Primarily because if you think about it, who are the people who are delivering healthcare services? These are individuals, usually at the level of individuals, your doctors. Your doctors are now outside of the role of technology when they are delivering healthcare services. And in their lifetimes, if you are going to implement any kind of technology, you need to suddenly have that shift or that buy-in at every stage of that doctor's career, which is much easier said than done, right? Because once things are comfortable, you just tend to continue with how it is. So it requires a major shift, sometimes even more than a 10x kind of a benefit at the level of the doctor, at the level of the patient, at the level of the ecosystem to get buy-in from all stakeholders. And that's where usually the challenge is. So we've seen that it's much easier to say no in healthcare than to say yes. Yes. However, what I feel has really changed over the last few years is that while some of us may have seen, look, the evolution of technology and how it has changed other industries could be applicable to healthcare. And early adopters, early innovators rather, have really tried to push that in the frontier. We're still really at the start of things. And even, and importantly, I think one of the key points that you raised was how has COVID really changed the entire picture? I think COVID has done a lot. Now, between the point of, or rather before COVID and after COVID, that is a really obvious transition point that many of us can see. The transition point is not necessarily just in the adoption of the solutions, but most importantly, I think is in the mental model and readiness psychologically that we need to be outward looking as healthcare system and stakeholders. Now that I think is the most exciting part because we are probably just at that inflection point of how technology is going to start getting adopted. When it comes to technology, I think there are two types of technology. Now, I'm not a technology person, but the way I would think about it simplistically is one is what you would call, the piping or infrastructure that needs to be shaped to connect your various stakeholders. Now, this is difficult work because it usually requires a top-down approach where it is shaped by policy, it is shaped by getting alignment from all stakeholders to say, look, between each of us, we own our own plot of land, but we need common piping to move between us. And this is where you all need to come in and we need to be on the same page with that. The other role of technology is probably what I would say, in my own thinking is what I refer to as last mile kind of technology. What is last mile kind of technology? Last mile kind of technology would be, look, a patient can't come to the hospital because of COVID. How do we deploy telemedicine so that the doctor can remotely provide that service? It is not, I don't look at it as tremendously transformative from the perspective of ecosystem, but at the point of COVID, we realized that, hey, this simple tool allows us to continue caring for the patient without compromise to their health. And so it becomes transformative in that sense. But at the end of the day, the ability for us to use it was really necessitated because of the circumstances, not because of the readiness necessarily of the ecosystem. Now, these two kinds of technologies need to go hand in hand for us to see the true change that we want to see over the next decade or so. It's not one or the other, but it's both. And I think COVID has had an important role to play in this entire scheme of things.
Aaron, that's a terrific way to launch this discussion. I think the idea of BC and AC before COVID and after COVID. But let me put it this way, and maybe I'll turn to Karen for her opinion here, is that at every point in time, you mentioned correctly that healthcare has always been a bit of a laggard when it's come to the adoption or the readiness of accepting the role of technology. One thought during the financial crisis in 2009, 2008, this is the time. Healthcare has to find new efficient ways. Then came the patent cliff, 2012, 2013. It has to happen now. We have to find readiness. We have to find places where more efficient usages and health records and so on and so on. And then it took this longer than expected period of time where a blank space happened. And here we are today, where we're coming out of the shadows of this pandemic. Some countries in this region are still struggling within that. Will this be truly that inflection point, Hiren, as you said, and will this possibly be one that we don't try and default back to how it used to be, but really try and find more sustainable ways for technology inclusion? Karen, what would you have to say to that? And I think also picking up on what Hiren said earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Dr. Hiren, I fully agree with what you said and love the way you mentioned how technology is both on the infra piece as well as on the solution piece, and they have to come together. But I would err on the side of being a bit more optimistic and saying, yes, they have come together. And this is where, Rohit, to your question, you're absolutely spot on. I think one of the silver linings of COVID has been a unifying factor, right? It has brought the entire world together, and the world has realized that, it's not just finance and retail and gaming that need technology, but, life is going to affect everybody. And that is why you see this big leap in transformative care during these, I would say, 2.5 years. That the good news is that it's not going back because people have realized the ease, the better outcomes that technology can bring. And it's like tasting something that is good and now wanting for more. So in my opinion, I think digital technology has become an integral part of healthcare. And I would say, I would agree with Dr. Huron that it is just the beginning. It is all set to revolutionize the practice of medicine in little ways at the moment, but I'm sure it's going to grow. And what one has seen during the whole COVID period is that, and even personally, that technology has actually improved operational efficiency in hospitals. It has improved standards. You're able to kind of share the standards of medical care. And it has also enhanced greatly the overall experience of both the patients and the healthcare providers. Because if you look at it, during the whole COVID time, nobody could go to, in Singapore, for example, people would not go to the hospitals. And so telemedicine became a big help because you could be in the comfort of your own home. So patient experience has definitely been enhanced. But there are other few areas that I think have really blossomed under this the technology expansion in healthcare. One, of course, is very basic, access to medical information and data. You have so many, all the hospitals coming out with apps that, helps the patient gather information of the hospital, disease areas, for example. So the patient has actually been educated, let's say, in a much better way. We've also, within a hospital, we've been able to use technology for better care coordination. We had this very interesting example, in big hospital groups where, let's say, I used to go to the hospital near my house, let's say it's Hospital X, and it had a subsidiary in let's say, City Y. And now because of COVID, I'm not able to travel. So I have to go to the one that is probably nearer to my house, or and that hospital does not have the medical records that the other subsidiary hospital had. So what happened is the whole care coordination came together within a hospital across different specialties. All the doctors could look at one unified medical record across different physical hospitals as well. They began to kind of coordinate to have a single unified medical record. So I would say that care coordination has really improved. That's another area where I personally see a lot of enhancements. A lot of hospitals who had, paper, the medical record on paper. I don't know about you, Rohit, but when I was younger, used to have these files, and the files, even in Singapore, would move, overhead to kind of move from one room to the other. Gone are those days. Now you see a lot of consolidation around your medical records. So that's a big blessing. And in some markets, patients can actually they have access to their own medical data. So you can literally carry it on a phone and travel with you. Let's say somebody has a specific allergy or a specific blood condition. They can actually have all their reports and discharge summaries, everything in the comfort of their phone, and they can travel wherever they go. And then, of course, Dr. Huron, you mentioned telemedicine. I think that's a big boon. Now even public hospitals are going into a hybrid mode, stay at home. There's no need for you to come and, congest the A&E or the clinics. If there's something that we can, like a refill of medication, something that can be done very easily through technology, so be it. And the other one that I think, even now, given this Ukraine war and Russia war that's going on, we've seen online education really kind of become big in the healthcare sector. So it's not just education for students, but also in the medical sector. Like Microsoft has come out with HoloLens, which has helped kind of remove geographical boundaries, connect people together. And so, and the last one that I personally feel has impacted a lot is around what we call it as digital front door for the patient. Hospitals pre-COVID never engage with the patient. Take your medication, you're done, come back in 3 months time for a regular checkup. But now hospitals are following up. How are you feeling after 5 days after an operation when you go home? Are there any side effects? And then using telemedicine to talk to patients. So I think that has changed quite a bit, where hospitals are very proactively engaging with patients. So I would say that, I can go on and on, but I think these are some of the, as what Dr. Huron, you said, some of the little blessings that we see where technology has played a great role in, having a better experience for patients. I think that's very important in being able to also have better patient outcomes. And of course, to a great extent, lowering costs, because now, the patient can be anywhere and you can talk to that patient. So I would say a big plus when it comes to technology in healthcare post-COVID.
So it's interesting, and I think for our listeners to sort of hear these points of view, the question is, when you see the readiness that you've got technology and potentially the role and the domain experience that health services need to sort of adopt and adapt, it's possible. As Kiran just said, it's true. It's like there are these small blessings that the pandemic has brought, that we can actually have coexistence. Now, obviously, the big question is, will healthcare policy be able to adopt towards tech policy? And it shouldn't then just be a conventional approach to how policies are driven, but really understanding the mechanics. Now, let me, Hiren, go back to what you said, which I think is really interesting. And I'll pick up also, Kiran, from what you just said here, that ultimately, health is delivered by individuals. They are not nameless, they're not faceless, they're not monoliths. We do refer to them as providers of health. We do provide to them as these sort of brick and mortar systems. But at the end of the day, you've got someone who is either acutely ill or having to live with a disease for a very long time. And I think one of the biggest areas that we seem to sometimes overlook is that, where does technology start and where does health finish? It shouldn't really matter now. It shouldn't be something which people tend to differentiate. So let me ask, I guess, a next question, which I think is an important one, that describe a world or describe a situation. And here, let me point to you here, because the idea of co-ownership of disease management, medical domain experience, this sort of interwoven community of digital nativity, is this that sweet spot? Is this where now it's not so much about finding solutions that are complicated and complex, but intuitive and personalized? Is this where perhaps cancer care, one of the leading priorities now for SDGs for 2030, are going to now, it's staring at economies in the face, but potentially is co-ownership possible thanks to this technology co-ownership? I was going to say intervention, but maybe that's not the right word. What would be your thoughts there?
So Rohit, if I could just ask, when you mean co-ownership, are you talking about the patient being an equal partner as his doctor, or maybe the patient, the doctor, and even other stakeholders being equal partners in that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's almost like all of the above. I mean, do we have to even limit the co-ownership of disease? Are there between doctor, patient, administrator, the access of certain medication, the provision and care and such like? But absolutely, and per your, well, what would you think would be the best definition? Would also be interesting to hear.
So I think the ideal healthcare utopia for me is one where you recognize and you appreciate the role of each of these stakeholders within its consolidated ecosystem. And that ecosystem is also built around the patient, right? Now, to take a leaf out of the book of people who are in the tech field, who may describe the implementation of technology, I like to think about it in 3 layers: data, infrastructure, and your network. I think this fundamentally is also addressing these 3 components would be critical to allow for us to have that ideal utopia for healthcare. Why? Because without any of these 3 in place, you don't have that ideal system. What do I mean by that? So data is absolutely necessary if you are going to connect the different stakeholders across a patient's entire, prevention to treatment journey. There are going to be various doctors who are involved in your care, various pockets of data silos that are being generated. This needs not just only be shared with the patient, but it also needs to be shared with stakeholders. It is not just important for data to be created, it is important for data to flow and to be shared. Now, if you don't have that data in place, nor if you don't have the infrastructure in place to allow for that data to flow, you can't actually build on the care quality that you want to actually be able to deliver to that patient. Infrastructure is something that I talked about earlier, right? In terms of your technologies that are going to be built, not just for information sharing, for improvement of the services within a particular healthcare institute, but also in terms of last mile. How do you actually improve the care that is delivered to a patient? This could be things like remote monitoring, digital therapeutics, what have you, right? The whole set of product solutions that are catered for that individual patient with a very different, today it's all about personalized medicine, right? And you would naturally need this plethora of unique products that have been, of course, tested, approved, and the outcomes of which are continuously being tracked. But all that forms within the infrastructure layer that needs to come together. And the last is your network. If at the end of the day, you've got all the stakeholders, the enterprise stakeholders like the hospitals or the industry and your solution partners, but say you don't have something as basic as how does the information flow back to the patient, the last component of that network, then your ecosystem is not ideal as well, right? And I think this is where, as from the policymakers' perspective, I know that they are looking into it, at least in the context of Singapore. But from the level of each of these stakeholders, we should also be introspecting and looking at how are we addressing the needs of data infrastructure and network from our perspective, not just waiting for it to be a top-down push, but what can we from a bottom-up perspective do as a patient, as a healthcare system, as a physician, as an industry partner, as a solution provider or a startup. And I think that all those three components need to come into place for us to actually move the needle here.
Wow. Kiran, I'm sure you have something to say to that. I think I'd love to hear in that context, the last mile from your point of view as well, because I think Hiren's brought that up in a very relevant context. Just as we talk about transport policy, just as we talk about education policy, it's the last mile that matters. Kiran, what would be your thoughts to what Hiren just said? But I would love to hear your thoughts on the last mile there as well.
Yeah, so again, Rohit, fully agree with what Dr. Hiren is saying, but I would like to kind of take a jab in a slightly different way. So the first thing is, yes, in healthcare, policymakers have always done a catch-on game, right? Technology has moved so fast. It always does. So at Microsoft, what we also do is we work very closely with regulators. So, earlier telemedicine was not allowed in Singapore. So the government in Singapore was very proactive. They kind of reached out and said, tell us, how does this whole thing work? What happens to data? Where does the data sit? Are there any, what happens to compliance, privacy? So this is where I think tech partners like Microsoft play a role, where we help relevant stakeholders understand, how data flows, as what Dr. Hiren was saying. What is the infra underneath? How is it secure? How compliant it is, to help them understand. And the beautiful part is that once they understand that, they move really fast. And you can see the outcome within 2.5 years. We are doing telemed as though it has always been there. So that's my first response. The second was in terms of ecosystem. Healthcare has been here for so many years. Now, if you think of building that ecosystem, things are going to be really slow. It's like getting a dinosaur to dance, for example. But the interesting part is that dinosaur has certain parts which are more flexible. And that's where, we need to take the jab. So like even in Singapore, I've seen payers, for example, retail, banks coming in and playing a big role in healthcare, because whatever you might say, healthcare data is one of the richest form of data, right? You have your medication, you have financial information, the billings that you do, you have your credit card information, you have socio-demographic information, you also have other data that you collect thanks to your smart wearables. So we do see all these players coming in, and that's where I find that ecosystem coming into play. But to Dr. Hiren's point, getting everybody to synchronize and play to the beats is going to take some time, but there are portions which have moved forward. So one of the areas that I do see the ecosystem play in a big way is around prevention. So even before people are aging, and even Singapore realizes that the health burden is going to be huge, and they are taking steps towards it. But even before that, how do we prevent people from even becoming sick? And that's where the wellness, the prevention part comes in. Because people are living longer, they don't want to, be the quality, they don't want to sacrifice the quality of life. They want to live healthy. I spoke to one of the doctors and they were saying, hey, at the age of 80, I should be able to jog the same way that I'm jogging now. So that is the expectation that's being built in. And this ecosystem play is very strong, and healthcare will be moving into that. But if you look at the wellness piece, if you look at the prevention piece, personalized ecosystem is the name of the game. right? And what do you mean by that? It means that as an individual, when you're looking at bringing in health and wellness, you're not just looking at the health per se. So for Karen, you're looking at, hey, what is her leisure activity? What is her work life? What is her family life? What's the social life? What's the community life? And when you bring these data sets together and they're interoperable, they talk to each other. They're not silo systems that, retail doesn't talk to finance. No, no, no. As Dr. Huron said, patient is at the center, but all these solutions and errors circle around the patient. So look at it. Let me give you an example. Using all this data and AI for sure, you can draw insights and say, hey, Karen has been spending long hours on the computer, sending out emails, and Microsoft already is starting on that using Viva Insight. And then you find that there is a spike in my online shopping. Now, a simple insight would be, hey, you really need to get up and walk and de-stress yourself because you seem to be, ordering a lot of food and doing a lot of retail online shopping. That's going to impact you financially and also health-wise. So if you can bring these different disparate systems together, you have an ecosystem. And for me, it might be shopping. For Dr. Huron, it might be, fitness. He looks very fit though. So it might be fitness. So it could be like, gym related activities or things like that. So everybody's ecosystem becomes very personalized. And that is a game changer because it's not like one pill fits all. But if Rohit loves doing, let's say, podcasts, probably he gets exposed to all the documentaries and, things like that. Personalized interest-based ecosystem is the name of the game.
Mm. Yeah, and if I were to sort of try and summarize what you both just said there, it's almost like looking at the traditional patient continuum of care, but then really looking at it from what that journey is like. So somebody who's suffering from a chronic disease, debilitating, degenerative, anything of that sort, it's not just about their health life, but it's also about their life. It's about what they've been eating, how long have they been sleeping, where have they been walking to or visiting, being able to track and manage the complexity of that. There was some wonderful work even done in mental health and depression that showed improvements if one could manage not just treatment, the physical medication, but just seeing where the patient was traveling and being. So it's almost like looking at the overall ecosystem. And I think picking up on the digital infrastructure and the network angle that Hiran brought in, I think that's a really relevant point. I guess let me sort of switch tracks to one area that I know many policymakers have been asking and thinking of. When we use the word personalized health and we talk about it being the next best thing ever that's going to now really solve things, the term financial toxicity always creeps in. While we've been reflecting and looking at the Singapore ecosystem and from a developed sense, much of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands is looking at personalized health and saying, that looks great, but how are we going to afford that? We've got patients who are already struggling under long-term care. There's obviously, issues related to just what is essential, not essential, and we'll cover that in other episodes. But in that light, and maybe here, and I'll switch back to you for this, is that do you see technologies overcoming some of this financial toxicity? And let me reflect a little bit about the work that you're doing on the clinical trial registry, which I think listeners would really sort of see as a real life example. How is that in some ways improving, I guess, outcomes, but then also trying to sort of alleviate some of that financial burden?
Thanks, Rohit. Maybe I'd like to firstly contextualize the concept of personalized medicine or personalized health in this case, just to really shape the discussion. So in this case, I think what I want to talk about is personalized healthcare delivery, particularly in the context of patients who are ill, say, for example, a cancer patient population. Today, there's a lot of discussion around personalized medicine, and oncology is a good field, where there's a lot of focus in terms of the concept of personalized medicine. So what does it actually entail? It entails a few things, not just looking at a person's, general body status or health or diagnosis, but sometimes even going down to the level of their genomics or omics profiles of, the genetics that they were inherited, and the genetics of their cancers or their disease. And how does that actually determine the sort of treatments they receive? How does that determine the outcomes of the disease that they have, for example? Now, that is this entire paradigm of personalized medicine. Now, today there was a very interesting article in the Straits Times. I'm not sure if the both of you managed to actually read it. It was centered around a patient who had a rare and aggressive form of cancer, where you would typically not be able to pull up a piece of research of published medication and say that, look, a particular treatment with this rare cancer has worked, is effective, and there is an approved therapy for that. And we see a lot of this in oncology, because what they started to realize is cancer is not just one disease. It is actually many diseases. And as we start understanding the genomics of these cancers, in fact, each patient's cancer can be quite different from the other, right? However, how it has all evolved is from the perspective of oncology as a treatment, where as a field, where initially most of our treatments were really, getting a little shotgun or a bazooka and just spraying all over the place with whatever therapies that would just work for the majority of patients with a particular cancer diagnosis. And if you think that that approach is really what has led us to the point where, at least from a policy perspective, we are able to look at studies that have looked at hundreds or thousands of patients, and from the perspective of these large pools of patients, determine that there is a particular drug that works across these broad patient characteristics, and hence we can then approve for the purpose that a funder would pay for that treatment. So here you have today, where, alluding to Karen's earlier perspective, when sometimes technology advances at such a rapid pace, policy needs to play catch up. And in this case, it's a great example in oncology, where we've gone down the road of being able to learn so much more about our cancers that we suddenly cannot pigeonhole that disease into what has been determined in the past from studies. Or if you take that approach, we may be actually not giving that entire landscape of potential options that a patient who already has limited options can have access to. So in this particular article, it's quite interesting because a patient was sequenced, was found to have some very rare mutations in a rare cancer subtype. And when they actually attempted the treatment, which did work, by the way, they could not get the funding to pay for that. The insurer said there's no evidence. The use of the drug was not approved for that genomic profile or for that cancer. And this is something that is very close to my heart. The work that OncoShot does is in relation to fundamentally oncology, plus data, plus looking at how all of these insights can be used to solve access to developmental therapies. The goal is that, by addressing these core fundamental issues, tomorrow we don't just talk about trials or better access to trials, but we can actually talk about even other use cases. For example, how do we know that a different approach for cancer has resulted in better outcomes? How can that data then be used to justify funding, for the use of a drug in this case? And how do oncologists be able to access this rapidly aggregating data and to apply it to their patients, instead of waiting for someone somewhere to publish something and hoping that they would find that piece of publication like a needle in a haystack? So OncoShot's work was fundamentally to build a bridge across healthcare systems and industry partners, where we said, look, if at the end of the day we wanted to build a bridge where data can flow with the end goal of improving outcomes, can we identify a use case in which let the data flow and solve a small problem for a start? That small problem that we're trying to solve is, for every individual or unique cancer patient with that particular cancer diagnosis and genomic profile, how can we rapidly identify new study treatment options that are happening not just in a hospital, but within the larger ecosystem? And from a larger ecosystem perspective, how can industry partners who are armed with thousands of molecules conducting more than 15,000 clinical trials for cancer alone across the world, say, look, I just realized that there are a group of unique patient populations in this part of the world existing here and now, right? Not just random estimates, but data that supports, aggregated data that supports this justification. And then to proactively bring these therapies back to our patients. And in this case, what we are really trying to do is at least build on a use case that leverages secure, aggregated insights to introduce therapies to patients, but also address that need to do it in a personalized manner from that unique cancer patient's perspective. And we think that this is not an easy job as well, because going back to this entire discussion about ecosystem and stakeholders, you would imagine that if you want to build a bridge across healthcare systems and industry, you don't just go in there with your machinery and say, thank you, everyone, let me build that bridge. No, you first need to get buy-in for someone to allow you to get onto their property, to give you that permission or that card to say, yes, you can start doing something. You obviously wouldn't start building a bridge and committing all your resources. You need to start with some floating wooden planks, if you may, just to get people across to the other side, and then eventually work on that infrastructure. And as a startup, that's the approach that we've taken. This has allowed us to learn a lot about personalized medicine, but it also has forced us to take the perspective of really identifying use cases where we can make things work and facilitate collaboration across the ecosystem. So that's my take on the role of ecosystems and why the ecosystem stakeholders require infrastructure and data to eventually get to the point where they can justify and get the end goal of personalized healthcare, which I think is an important outcome that we want to be able to achieve over the next decades. But there's a long way that needs to be done. And while there are already baby steps that are being taken, there's more work that needs to be done in this field.
So in a way, rather than that huge bridge right away and scaring the life out of some people, start to throw across a few planks, a few little bits and pieces that people feel that they can at least tread water and start to go over. Now, interesting that you say this because, let's face this, economic debt and debt's coming home to roost post-pandemic for Southeast Asia in particular, it's forcing governments to make some really hard decisions. And what you're saying there here, and I think is absolutely right, that if there are examples or areas where technologies are alleviating this burden, as you just outlined in your own way, you're beginning that process. And if more can understand what it takes to get there, we're able to sort of find ways that removes not just angles of financial toxicity, but the entire policy making itself begins to become more hybrid. The right resources at the right time for the right trial, for the right patient, as personalized as you could get. You've also touched upon, I think, something which I think is a critical aspect, and that is this term of absenteeism. I think the shout out to our common friend here, probably Salma Khalik, whose article you referred to, and absolutely, I think, has really raised an issue that has been very present, and that is the fact that where are payers and insurers in this whole sequence of things? To use your analogy, when we throw a few planks over that river, how are we looking at the role of insurers particularly? Because at the end of the day, we can have all the best technology and we can have all the best training, but if we don't have participation from the ones who will help afford it, then we really aren't going to get anywhere. I don't know if that's a question if anyone wants to sort of give an opinion on, but any thoughts to that, or should we just treat that more as a?
I would just like to add to that, and I think this might be controversial or a very non-friendly statement, but as a physician who takes care of patients and wearing one hat, and in the other hat being on the startup side of things where you're engaging multiple stakeholders, I think at the end of the day, from the perspective of payers, it's about dollars and cents.
Yeah.
Right. So I asked the question rather, why can't insurers or payers be the ones who actually drive the need to actually get data exchange platforms to be built in a safe and secure manner? Because fundamentally, it is going to be this data that impacts how you analyze the information and outcomes, and determine what you're going to reimburse, right? However, the feedback that we tend to get is, well, it is not going to save me money today. At this point in time, I'm not too sure whether I'm going to invest into that. Today, I work in a landscape where, for many of my cancer patients, when they submit an insurance claim, I get a piece of paper that's 5 pages long for me to fill up everything, all the details about, their cancer diagnosis, treatment, and then I'll print out, the investigations. This is all compiled. We send it over to the insurance company, and then something happens in that black box. And then eventually someone then makes a call. Okay, looks like everything's in place. Now, is this an approved drug for this indication? Is the hospital doing the right thing for this patient? And then we then pay, right? This is the current framework. And when we suddenly start asking, look, how are we going to get to the end point of personalized healthcare? How do we actually convince the eventual payers that this new model is justifiable, right? No one is going to come on board and just say, look, I'm going to take on the responsibility of building that bridge, right? And I think this is where it's an unfortunate situation, but I think the mindsets can be changed. And I think technology and its ability to cross that bridge could actually be transformative in that process. But for this group of stakeholders, we probably need some additional effort and buy-in to say that, look, I think that's an important role that you can play in facilitating and improving this entire ecosystem. And where are you going to be on that? If you just look at yourself as a payer, and as a role of as a payer, I just want to make sure I don't pay as much as I can, or rather I don't pay as much that is not needed, then you're never going to make it, that transformative change. And I mean, that's just my controversial statement for the day, but I'll stop there.
I don't think it's controversial at all. I think that's something which many people are talking very actively. And I think it's an area that we really need to be focusing on as much as possible. Kiran, would you have any add-ons to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me be the harbinger of good news to you, Dr. Huron. And the news is that, yes, the payers are in. The public payers are probably a little more slower because the scale is larger, but the private payers, and I work with 5 of them right now as we speak, they are already in. Now, if you get into the shoes of the payer, the problem that they also have is when you deviate from the standard of care, they have no way to analyze and understand whether that's the right fit. So what the payers have done, and a classic example is COVID. We never had insurance for COVID, but now in Singapore, we also have insurance for the reimbursement for the ART tests as well. So payers are catching on. It's just that they are probably a step behind, but yes, they are there. So what the payers are doing, and you're spot on, it's all about dollars and cents. So the payers are saying, hey, this particular pool of patients, I don't have much leeway because the model has already been built. But what if I prevent people from being sick? And what hospitals have not been able to do, what public payers have done in a limited way, private payers are stepping in and saying, I'm going to reward you for not getting into that bucket. So a lot of work is being done in preventing. So if somebody is pre-diabetic, preventing them from becoming fully diabetic, right? So that's where the payers are saying, if I'm able to control the funnel over there, then my ultimate burden, let's say years down the line, is going to be much lesser. So we see a lot of very interesting work being done in that space. So the answer to this is yes, the payers are there, and we're very happy about that. And Rohit, if I could just step back a little bit to the earlier question you asked around financial toxicity. And I think that's where I think technology can really play a very good role, because I was actually, when we were discussing this, we were reading a few articles from some of the key research companies, and what they have also come out with data is that adult patients with cancer, obviously they are more likely to be bankrupt than people of the same age but who do not have cancer. And it's seen that patients who are declared as bankrupt, the mortality rate is much higher. So this is something, and of course, when you, especially because we're talking about cancer, I'm sure Dr. Huron, you'll agree with me that low income levels have been associated. So if you look at the incidence of cancer, and if you were to split that into different economic strata, you do see that low income levels have been associated with increased cancer death, but not just cancer for that matter, even cardiovascular risk factors, which is really big in Singapore, and also higher financial burden. So there is a very, I would say, strong link between, if you use the word financial toxicity and the incidence of a disease and mortality rate. Now, this is where technology really comes in, because, technology can't differentiate, are you rich, are you poor? Like when COVID happened, beds were in great shortage in India, right? So, and if you have the ability to pay, you get a bed. If you have a contact, you're able to get a bed. But the thing is that technology really doesn't matter. It does not differentiate. It's just access. And I actually wrote down, as you were talking, 3 very interesting things. You see, when you're looking at a cancer, a rare form of cancer, and now most cancers are becoming rare because it's very specific to that particular individual. And so one of the things that in Microsoft we kind of are working towards is in being able to reduce the cost of drugs, because the problem starts from there. Why should the drug be so expensive? And then the answer comes that, hey, we spent billions of dollars in the R&D. We spent like 12 years, but COVID vaccines have shown us it can be done much faster. And that's where we are looking at in Microsoft, working with partners to come out with virtual clinical trials. Is there a hypercompute that we can use to kind of crunch that data so that the 12 years that pharma spends in coming out with the drug, can you kind of make that into 6 years or 3 years? That's one. The second, and therefore your developmental therapy is much cheaper, right? So that's one thing I wanted to share. The second thing is, even with the most rare form of cancer, we do have information. The problem is that we're not able to kind of get all this information together. And interestingly, Microsoft, and the reason why I keep saying Microsoft is because I love these little tools that they come out with. One you can look up is called text analytics, where it says you can throw a bunch of data at into text analytics. It could be structured, unstructured. It could be data from handwritten notes. And what it does is, let's say if you have a rare form of cancer that you're researching on, it's able to show connections, primary connections, secondary connections, but it could be patient data versus the medication they were given and the outcomes. So as a doctor, for me, it gives me a sense, it's a really driving blind, it gives me a GPS that says, okay, these are the possible outcomes. Now, based on your ability and capability, you can deep dive into one of them. Of course, it's beyond that, it's an uncharted path, but at least it's not as dark as it would be. So I think that's where technology plays a good role in looking at data in different forms. It exists. It's just that how do you bring everything together? The last one, I think, is economies of scale. When you look at certain technologies that are very expensive, but when the adoption rate is higher, telemed is a classic example. If it's going to cost me $10 lesser, I would rather, go for a telemed. So technologies, when there's economies of scale and scope, that would bring down the price per point, and technology would help in that. So I think these are some of the ways in which you should be looking at the problem, not just from the payer's point of view, but also the cost point of view. A fever is a fever. I think 15 years ago, I probably paid $5, $10. Today, I pay minimum $60. Why is that? These are the questions that we need to ask and see how can technology really bring down costs? How can you bring in efficiencies into the operation, which, we would look at when you're looking at an assembly line of manufacturing, but do we look at a healthcare hospital efficiency? Where are these costs coming from? And that's, I think, where we need to look at data.
Really, really powerful words there. Coming up on our hour, I think first of all, let me just thank Hiren and Kiran for what I think was a terrific way to begin to sensitize everyone to the complexity of technology or health. No, it's technology, health, hybrid. It's the realization of systemic changes, the inclusion of vital stakeholders, the reality, as we've heard from both speakers today, that there is traction being made. And not just because of this last couple of years, but there's been efforts that have been ongoing continuously And perhaps we're now looking at the positivity of outcome, the glass half full, which is absolutely great for patients, caregivers. We've heard about health services, the personalized care, and of course, economies that need to now look at efficiencies and of course, obviously, scale. If I could just, in a way, ask Hiren and Kiran, what would be in your top one sentence, your summary and outlook for where you see all this headed to? Hiren, what's your takeaway for our listeners?
So I think the future is definitely a brighter one. I'm very positive that there are a combination of both internal motivations and external motivations to really change how healthcare can be delivered for the future. But I also think that there's a lot of work to be done by all stakeholders. And healthcare is unique in that sense that policy, technology, and the willingness, the readiness is going to be all equally important for us to effect this change. But I see that if this can happen, then the lives that we're going to lead over the next few decades are going to be tremendously different than the lives that our previous generation have led.
Kiran?
So Rohit, apologies, but can I kind of take more than a sentence? So, I mean, I had a very different take on this. And I think, strategies I think one of the things that we need to look at is health behaviors, right? Where we're looking at how is a person different from the other when it comes to, managing your own personal wealth. And I think this is where we need to have a strategy, right? Using data and insights. But again, whatever the initial gain that we would achieve through this understanding, it would diminish over time because, we need to actively intervene, understand people and have an intervention. Then once that kind of comes to an end, you move ahead and then look at people. So it's basically understanding and profiling the patients, and what motivates them is very important. And that's where technology can really help. But again, we are human beings. So technology cannot work alone. What we need for technology to be very effective is to include incentives, provider incentives, social support incentives. So that's where we are creatures of rewards, right? We do things that we are rewarded about. So I think understanding the profile of patients, being able to see what motivates them, what incentivizes them, for example. And that's where sharing of information and having a more holistic picture of a person's health becomes very important, rather than, just keeping it in your EMR or just keeping it on some app. And this is where, technology can really help. When you bring all that data together, you can identify health risks early. You can focus more on well-being rather than treatment, because all the discussion around costs and cure is great, but I think we need to manage the beginning of the funnel as well. And as Dr. Huron said, this is where I think we should move towards more of precision health or precision engagement, personalized health. And we can do all that with technology because we are able to collect data in an interoperable way. We have AI and ML. So I think we really need to get on being able to use what we have in a very, very insightful way.
Just get on and get it done, right? I mean,
exactly.
Just, the time is here. Well, that brings us to the end of our first episode. For those listeners, we'd like to sort of just let you know to stay tuned for episode 2, which is actually going to pick up on some of our discussion today, and where and how does personalized health, the use of technology, really evolve and get itself into, and we'll go deeper into that. Is it a double-edged sword? Will it actually really result in outcomes and so on? So some exciting stuff ahead. Thank you for listening. This is the Voices Project. You can follow us on the thevoicesprojectasia.org. Yep, almost forgot that long one there. And again, I'd like to give a deep thanks to our speakers today, and you can find us on our RSS and Spotify feeds as well. Thank you so much, and thanks for listening.